Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you live around the world. Today I am further looking at how I create the hub structure, getting into a little bit more of the detail that may be required for when I actually create the individual components. And that may well entail having some closer in-depth looks at the individual parts, and I thought putting center lines etc. for placement in the SketchUp model might help. Well, that gets a little bit messy, to be fair, and yes, I am probably over egging this particular recipe, but when you start putting center lines on individual components like the Spax screw model here, the washer, the interface and the second interface, while handy, yes, they do actually start to get complicated, get messy, but I think they may be necessary in the short run. Now, this was taken directly out of another drawing, another model, and you can see how the different parts were inclined relative to their position in the dome, in the structure itself. I extracted the hub, and from around that, all these would have been inside, of course, and I have overlaid the radial positions of the hub. And this is what I was saying, that you can get very accurate positions for our holes, not by knowing these radial, these readings, how many degrees, but rather if I print out something with the lines already on it, they are by default as accurate as SketchUp could possibly have created, and all I need to do is to lay said printout onto my hub and etch a line onto the hub and then go from there. That would be more practical. Let's say if I stop saying more accurate but say more practical, than trying to find a center which isn't there, because it's a tube after all, and then moving, making a mark and then moving 54.5 degrees. That's going to be more difficult and more likely to create an error than if I had a printout, overlaid it on top of my hub, and then made the marks relative to where the lines are. So that's my logic there. So that's that you could imagine that if that was on a piece of A4 paper, cut it to size, make the marks, yay. Then I thought, okay, so now I've done that, let's put some center lines on the drawing at least to represent where I may have center punched a hole. Then I thought, wouldn't it be nice to know where they are radially? So I've added lines in here to show the center lines of the bolts and the screws. And these wee ones here, if I unhide, were 90 degrees to the radial lines so that I could create other aspects of those marks. As I said, it gets quite busy, but it winds up with, I think, a better understanding and go between the SketchUp program and the workshop situations. Then I thought I'd make some of the individual components. I didn't really scale them, or rather make sure they were 100% accurate, but I took the parts from here and then moved them and rotated them into the native XYZ, the red, green, blue axes of SketchUp, so that now that if I take these components, they will all have the model itself plus the lines for the axes relative to, as I said, the native SketchUp axes. That makes it a whole lot easier for manipulating when you put it back into a model. I had also made a comment, and just shows you how sometimes we go backwards in our thinking, that while the bottom assembly with the threaded rod that goes through it, which are these pinky purplish assemblies here, or components here, that's relatively straightforward to create. We simply take a section of flat steel, a flat stock, and then we can arc it round on our large disc sander and create a curve so that it better mates in with the inner surface of our hub. So we want this nicer interface between the hub and this particular washer. Then I proceeded to say, well, I'm going to reconsider using screws rather than the tabs that I once had, and I'd give each a 50-50 chance of being used. And then I proceeded once again to make these blocks angled to suit the individual position of the strut, and each individual strut has a different angle. That's a problem. Went through the effort of, literally I got to this stage and I thought, hang on a moment, I need an interface between the interface. I call these washers, these blocks, interface, because they're literally interfacing between the screw or the bolt head and the hub. And I thought, oh yeah, I've already gone through this. And this is what I'm saying, it was like backward thinking sometimes. If we had a bit of bar stock or even a bit of tube, we can cut it, drill through it, and it can allow the screw head to rock up and down on this particular part, creating the specific angle as it requires. I don't need these angled blocks at all, which would have been a little bit problematic because they would have been, each one would have been different. Ideally, I would have had to have 3 different individually cut and angled blocks. This one, and this one. Of course, these 2 are just reflections of these 2. So 3 here, and then we'll go to the next hub. They will be likely different than these ones, so it gets a little bit annoying, and there's no guarantee I'd get that 100%, whereas this does effectively, because the outer circumference of the rod, it could have been a 25 solid bar or some such, would just move until it finds its happy place relative to the head of the screw or the bolt that I go to use. So that's that there. Just a little bit of a larger diameter and a thinner piece makes it a little bit more chunky, perhaps, but a little bit more robust, perhaps. But that seems to take care of the issue of how we can use this assembly in this position to not cause problems. My concern was that, and to be fair, the loading that would go on this bolt or this screw would be not a lot, in my opinion, as a percentage of what's holding the whole structure together. The lower threaded rod would be doing the majority of the holding together. And this one here, the top assembly, if I said it was 25% of the total, I'm not an engineer, I'm just guessing. You pick the figure, but it would be much less than the lower. But we still want it to perform well, And going back to what I was about to say, I didn't want the loading of the head of the screw to be such that it might fail. I could never see that happening. Matthias Wandel just recently did a video where he showed the strength or the withdrawal resistance of a drywall screw, and he screwed it into a piece of metal. So that's a drywall screw being screwed into metal. The pilot hole wasn't all that great. It wasn't all that tight. So therefore the embedment of the threads weren't all that great in the metal section that he was screwing the drywall screw into. But in his little machine that he has for doing withdrawal pressures, they were rating like between 400 kilos to half a ton, 500, 600 kilos of withdrawal pressure just for a tiny little drywall screw. And now he was holding on to the head of the drywall screw, which is where I'm coming from on this, and it still took over 400 to 500, 600 kilos to snap the darn thing or pull out of the metal that it was screwed into. Now, this is like a factor higher than anything that a drywall screw. This is in this case, it's a 10 by 140. The 10 millimeters is, in specs speak, is over the threads, not the shaft size. But the shaft itself is still 8.5, 9 millimeters thick. Way heavier than any drywall screw. So any pressure on this would be in the multiple, probably tons, like metric tons of pressure. Whereas what we're talking about, probably will never get to see anything like that. So is this overkill? Yes, it is. But let's have what happens if it goes wrong? What happens if there's an extreme situation? What happens if all those issues taken care of by simply having this? I've seen it where the screws are just drilled through the hole in the hub, and the head of the screw beds into a much smaller hole in the hub itself. Fine, if you've got a small or light dome. This is not a small nor a light dome, and in some instances, especially in the leg part of it, the bottommost triangle, it is extremely stressed, whereas the other parts of the dome much less so. So anyway, I'm taking care of a specific design, not a general design for the screw fixing, and in aspects of it this may well be required, not just a luxury or overkill. Equally, in that highly stressed area of the effectively the top of the dome to the leg, this may not even be enough with the screw, and I may well go back to a tabbed type scenario. So just saying that there may be more than one demand. That's where an engineer would come in. Their knowledge and experience would be able to point to issues that I'm only vaguely aware of, if even aware of. But being a nervous Nelly at times, I overkill the design. Anyway, there we go. So all I did was I made sure that the component has points of reference, i.e. the lines of the axes, so that when I embed them into a model, I can take the very definable point and insert and rotate to my heart's content, so I get it more accurate. Because I was finding it a little bit troublesome when you went to insert, say, this particular, we'll do it right now. I haven't done this, so you'll see my logic. If I take that, the computer's a bit slow because I've been hammering it this morning. I can take it to there. I know I've inserted the screw into the very center of the assembly. I can take the angle of this particular strut and I can rotate this around if I want. Now you can see here now straight away that's not, yeah, I'll do it. I'm going to rotate the screw until it becomes aligned with this axis. It means now, it may mean not a lot to you, but when you're going to manipulate an item, trust me, it gets awfully tricky. But that point there needs to just be moved up to there. And now the axes that I've inserted into the model of the screw can now be used to rotate my screw, which is the center line here, up to there. Whoops. Now this is where, let's just see. I need to rotate using the X-ray facility. I can select inside the model the axis, because sometimes you have to zoom way out or put a guide in, and that's a pain. Whereas the X, or the X-ray, so hitting the X on the keyboard, allows me a functionality that wasn't there before. So now I have the alignment of the screw to the axis. This line is level, it's not inclined yet, but we'll get there. Now I can move that through, oops, my apologies. This is what you can actually see some of the issues that you need to overcome. Sorry for, as I said, sorry for the lag of the computer, but that's what's causing some of my issues at the moment. And I can approach that way, assembling my hubs very accurately. I know the center lines are going to be working properly, as we can see there. I can then distance this back and put the interfaces in, which has their own center line for alignments, etc. And that way I have less drama. If I want to incline this up and down, because it's in plane relative to the strut, I can now use the center lines here to give it rotation, and that way I can get it inclined to the right angle. So yeah, that's what it was for. Long-winded way of saying it's much easier now to manipulate the components than it once was. Rightio, that's it. Long-winded, but I think beneficial. If not to you, it was to me. Okay, I'll see you in the next one now. Bye.